mean, Americans and their idea of freedom, it's not freedom from hunger. It's not freedom from want. Okay. And it's not even freedom to elect who you'd like to have in power, because you've got two choices, Republican or Democrat. You know, it's a bizarre notion of freedom that they have in America. What China wanted was freedom from want, freedom of being forced from poverty to do things, rather than having the freedom that a decent income gives you to live. And so that's the Chinese focus. Now, the Americans will continue pushing this freedom nonsense in one of the world's worst democratic systems on the planet. They'll continue pushing that. But if China doubles again in the next 8 years, which is unlikely, it might take them 15 years this time, then the gap between China and America is going to be so enormous that, you know, forget you're talking.
Steve Keen is an Australian economist and author of many books, also an honorary professor at UCL who predicted the 2008 financial crash years early. Professor Keen, welcome to the program.
Nice to be here. Thank you for the invite.
I've had to introduce you as an economist, although I don't think I would be exaggerating if I say that you feel nothing but cold disdain for your profession these days. Could you tell me why?
When people meet me at a party and ask what I do, I say I'm an anti-economist. But I don't want to be associated with discipline or its views. So yes, you're quite right. And the reason is that it's something which it has a plausible model of the economy in the same way that Ptolemy and Aristotle had a plausible money model of the universe. In other words, it's a model which fits the data to some extent, so long as you're looking backwards in time, but has absolutely nothing to do with the actual structure of the economy. So they've completely misled us about the nature of capitalism, and that's one reason why we're in deep doo-doo at the moment.
I studied communication at uni, also pretty useless stuff, but had an introduction to economics in my first year. And after failing the exam twice, I barely
congratulations.
passed. Thank you. Yes, indeed. My mother was not happy. Yeah, I barely passed on my third go. So this is an excellent start to the episode. We're off to the races. I'm happy about that.
Yeah, I mean, one reason I wrote my first major book is called Debunking Economics, which you're probably aware of. And the reason I wrote it is because people like you would, flagellate themselves over failing exams and not being able to understand it, and it's too difficult for me. And I think, no, it's not difficult, it's garbage. And if you fail to understand it, that's actually a mark of intelligence. Whereas people who fall for it become zealots for their model, and that's why they're so dangerous. They believe the world would look a lot better if it would look more like the economics textbook. And then they start taking away parts of the world that make it function properly, and we end up in the dysfunctional society we're in today.
I wish we did this interview 20 years ago, because then after failing, I could have, told my parents, see, mark of intelligence. Yeah, we're all good. All right, Professor, we're living through some pretty interesting times. This seemingly never-ending cocktail party that we've enjoyed in the West is slowly coming to an end, or maybe not so slowly even. I want to talk about this decline and even more about the rise of China, but I realized I have a few pieces of the puzzle missing here. I was thinking just before the interview that it was never really properly explained to me, at least not beyond a few vague tidbits, how the West was able to economically dominate the world after the Second World War. To us, it was always just the default, because we were living in it and through it. But how was America able to rebuild half of Europe and the entire Japan and send people to the moon and swamp the world with its entertainment, for better and for worse? And most of all, stay the global hegemon for such a long time? Was it really the dynamism of its economic model? Was it ruthless exploitation of the third world? Or was it something much more random? I don't know, luck.
I think the basic answer to that question is yes. Okay. Because, there is a way in which America was set up geographically to be a dominant power, and that is that there's this enormous open plain between the Appalachians on one side and the Rockies on the other, and this enormous fertile land, which was, of course, they displaced the Indians there. Of course, let's not forget that. But they basically treated it as empty land which they could just invade and take over, and that gave you an enormous demand in general. Obviously, one thing which was a major part of forming America were the telegraphs and the railways. So all these things made you need new products to link together disparate parts of a population which are as far apart in, like, America as if you from Los Angeles to New York is further than from, I believe, I'm certain it is the case, it'd be further than going from London to virtually Persia. It's a huge landmass. And that gives you a huge open market. You're a single economy, where the other economies are more disparate, so you can have larger economies of scale when you build technology. So that was certainly part of the foundation. I think another part of it, and this is something which puts me in opposition to another critical component of economics, which is modern monetary theory. I agree with them on government money creation. Okay, that's not what I'm complaining about. I think their arguments on trade are garbage. Quite literally garbage, because they argue that exports are a cost and imports are a benefit, and therefore it's good to run a trade deficit. Now, when you look at what happens when you're the hegemon, and Britain was the hegemon, of course, for the rise of UK, the hegemon's currency is overvalued because it's being used for trade, for everybody's trade, not just for buying stuff off England. You've got to have pounds to buy, India has to have pounds to buy stuff off China, that sort of thing. What that means is that the reserve currency is overvalued, which makes its manufacturing sector less competitive. And therefore, one of the less dominant countries, one of its vassals at the time, can develop has a cost advantage in exports, and therefore can industrialize and develop its technology better. That's what America did while England was the hegemon, right up until, of course, the beginning of World War II. So it got an advantage, which it lost when it became the reserve currency. And I think the same thing is repeated now. But in the aftermath of World War II, of course, Europe was devastated, so Europe couldn't produce goods and services, and therefore America exported large amounts, had a large trade surplus, but it also invested, that's where the Marshall Plan came in. So that's seeing its role as being as reconstruction of the rest of the world, which is not the attitude America has today, of course. So that enabled both. You had America willing to take imports from Germany and the rest of Europe to enable those industries to develop. So you had a period of expanding trade, with America being dominant just because of the sheer advantage from having not had any bombs on its own territory, continental USA in the war, whereas Europe was wiped out. So was Japan. So are large parts of Asia. And so it had that advantage. And then it's lost it over time because, again, now it's got the overvalued currency. Its vassal, in that sense, that it's now taking over, is China. So you had this huge dominance for a while because of the sheer industrial might of the country and the fact that it could do this when it wasn't the reserve currency. Ever since it's been the reserve currency, it's been hiding into nothing to go in the same direction as the UK, deindustrializing over time. And that's where we've ended up now. So I think it did start as a dominant country, and for good reasons, but it's by making the mistake of the Bretton Woods agreements, which is where the post-war financial system was designed. Keynes wanted to have a system with a neutral unit of exchange being used for international trade. The American delegation insisted on using the US dollar. That gave us our current situation, and it's when you look at it from my perspective and the perspective of many non-orthodox economists, this was just a catastrophe waiting to happen. It was a question of how many years it would take until America was sufficiently deindustrialized to be in serious trouble. And I think now that's the situation it's in.
We're going to talk about the present moment a bit later, but if we stay in the past just for a moment longer, why did the Soviet Union, on the other hand, turn out to be a failure? Because the Soviets were onto something for a while, weren't they? If nothing else, they were developing cutting-edge technologies just as fast as the Americans, sometimes like in the beginning of the space race, even faster. And yet it all came tumbling down in a pretty spectacular fashion in the late 80s. Why did the Soviet system prove to be a dud ultimately?
Yeah, I mean, there's two reasons. The Bolsheviks, who the particular branch of communists who took over Russia after World War One, with the Russian Empire collapsing at the time, it was almost an accident. October 17, they didn't expect to win. It just one of the "my God, we won. What do we do now?" type thing. And the Bolsheviks were their particular sect of Marxism argued that you didn't need to go through capitalism. You could jump from feudalism to socialism in one go. By state industrialization. You also had Stalin, and that's an extremely important point. But the reality is that Russia's high tech in terms of space races and military and so on match the Americans well and truly. So they've developed nuclear weapons. Of course, the technology was passed to them by Americans who quite rightly realized that if America had the sole power, it would be a tyrant. I think we can see that now. So the American scientists, as pacifists, gave the secrets of the bomb to the Russians, and the Russians then developed it as far as Americans managed to do. They had the first satellite was Sputnik. The first person in space was Yuri Gagarin, so they had the lead there definitely. Where they lost out was in consumer goods. And this is where it actually hits individuals very directly. So and this relates to the way in which they tried to industrialize. And what they were persuaded by an engineer called Feldman was that the best idea was to focus on building the means of production first and foremost, so in investment goods, and not worrying about consumption goods, letting consumption goods sort of take up the slack. Now, that worked brilliantly while there were many, many serfs to be converted to industrial workers. So when you started off in 1917, the country was still feudal. You still had people who were serfs, bonded to the land. Yep. They could be sold with the land in that sense. So it was a very primitive society. And that meant that you needed, every last sector of the economy needed to be industrialized to some extent. Agriculture, the manufacturing system, all needed to be developed. That meant that if you're doing a 5-year plan, every sector got less than it needed. Okay. And then what that meant was, in that situation, the easiest way to make sure you could fulfill the quantitative totals you were given for your particular industry was to produce last year's model, not to do any technological innovation. And what that meant was the rate of growth was limited to the rate of growth of population in terms of the number of people working in factories. So as you transfer people from being serfs to factory workers, output rose dramatically. But then when you reach the point where you've done all that, the rate of growth was just the population growth. You didn't have technological change in consumer goods. I'll give you my funniest example of that. My first major girlfriend's brother wanted to buy a 650cc motorbike in 1975. Now, he couldn't afford a Honda or a Kawasaki, or let alone a Hog, So he found he could buy a Russian motorbike for $650. Whereas the Japanese ones were $3,000. I helped him open it up. It arrived in a wooden crate. It was called a Cossack. We took the wooden crate off and found a whole lot of oil-soaked rags, took those oil-soaked rags off, and there, on a wooden pallet, tied down by ropes, was a 1942 BMW. Okay. So what you got was no technological development in the consumer industry, and that's what the vast majority of people felt. They might have got a nice warm glow out of Sputnik, but they weren't orbiting the planet themselves. So the ordinary person's life became quite harsh in Russia. And you could actually, you could order a television set and get it 10 years later, that sort of thing. And I literally, an ex-girlfriend of mine had that situation. So, I'm going, these are personal anecdotes about actual people that I know went through this experience. Whereas the West, had, basically the attitude of the West is screw the working class, pay as low a wage as possible. You have multiple companies all competing, trying to produce different products, and multiple companies making motorbikes in that case. The way you get people to come in your door rather than your rival's door is to innovate. So you get a higher rate of innovation in a market economy than you get in a centrally planned economy when it comes to consumer goods. Now, this is not my argument. This is an argument of a brilliant Hungarian economist called János Kornai, when he was trying to explain why did the Soviet grow so slowly versus America when the argument was they'd grow more rapidly. And he talked about having what he called demand-constrained economies versus resource-constrained economies. And capitalism, he said, is demand-constrained, therefore innovation occurs, whereas socialism was resource-constrained, therefore innovation didn't occur. And so you got more stable growth in Soviet, but no innovation going on. Whereas with the Americans, you got booms and busts, but a high rate of technological innovation. So that's the explanation for why Russia failed. It ignored the consumer goods sector and therefore didn't have technological advance. And ultimately, if you're not improving your capacity to produce output per worker over time, and you're not changing the products, then you're going to lose in a capitalist system over time, a market economy over time. And that's what happened to the Russians in that sense. So I think one the really important thing that China's done is realize that. And they've managed to make a combination which gives you state planning of essential services that everybody else needs, like rail transportation, electric power, water, sewerage, et cetera, that's all provided by the state. It's just there. So private sector can expand into it. And they've got rampant competition in the private sector, not just between different firms, but even between different provinces in China, all trying to be the leading province in some particular area. Then one becomes dominant. So you've got a huge amount of experimentation, innovation going on in the Chinese market economy, which is part of the Chinese socialist system.
One last question about the past, and then we're going to talk about the present. I've heard this a couple of times now and want to ask you whether it holds any water, because it's really intriguing, but I have no idea if it's true. Some people say that the relative prosperity of people in the US and Europe after the Second World War was carefully maintained, because back then the average American worker or a European worker, if squeezed hard enough, they could always say, hey, there's an alternative system over there. It might not be perfect, but those people over there in the Soviet Union, they have free healthcare, free education, they have a pension waiting for them after they retire. And that made the politicians and the elites in the West anxious since the Cold War was in full swing, which is why they actually made an effort to prop up people's living standards, and which is also why after the fall of the Berlin Wall, they didn't have to do that anymore. Do you reckon there's any truth to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And like I can even go on government policy documents, because people will talk about Keynesian versus neoclassical economics. But if you look at what it implies at the policy level, the so-called Keynesian thing said we must make sure there's full employment. Whereas the neoclassical said you make sure there's price stability. So we flipped from full employment to price stability. Now, when full employment was the effort, was the focus, I'll give you a quote from the document I know best on this front, which is the Australian White Paper on Employment. So a policy document by the Australian government, written in 1944, published in 1945. And it said, and this is a quote from it, the object of government policy is to maintain such pressure on the economy as to guarantee a shortage of men rather than a shortage of jobs. Okay. Now, what that meant was, and also because after World War II, there's lots of reasons as to why, but the level of private debt plunged from 100, in America's case, private debt fell by 67%. It was roughly 150% of GDP at its peak in 1932. It was 50% roughly in 1945. So, a 2/3 reduction. That meant that people weren't carrying large amounts of debt. And it was possible for a single man, this is of course the days of the 50s, a single male worker with a wife and 3 kids to buy a house on his salary. Okay, that was common. So at that stage, 2 things in favour. First of all, whenever there was a rise in unemployment, the government would spend more to try to reduce the unemployment. So deficits weren't something the government worried about. If they needed more spending, they'd simply do the spending. And secondly, they were guaranteeing that a single worker could basically afford the essentials of life, food and support for the family, and buying a house. Now, when we went to the fight inflation first thing, the whole emphasis upon employment disappeared. The important thing was what they saw as price stability. And if unemployment has to go up to cause price stability, we'll let it happen. Okay? Now, what that meant was the focus that existed in the early post-war was very much pro the mass of the population, pro workers. And the reason for that was obvious. You'd had the Great Depression, so massive numbers of people had starved, or had horrific situations during the Great Depression. And there were communist and fascist rallies in America at the time. So it was quite possible to go to a completely different political system. And then you had World War II where, I don't know how many Americans died, but a massive number of Russians died and many other nationalities, and tens of millions of people died. And so they realized just how close they came to revolution in the 1930s and just how many people suffered and had every right to be angry about having suffered during the Great Depression of World War II. So that meant the whole emphasis was on maintaining the living standards of the poorest part of the population. Okay? When you go to the inflation, who gives a shit about the workers' wages? Workers' wages cause inflation, yada, yada, yada. And we're in the modern world where you need male and female need to work. They've got to borrow so much money to buy a house that they decide not to have kids. That's the world we're in now.
Let's shift our attention to China and the present. I think we've all heard of Deng Xiaoping's reforms, which shifted China's state-controlled economy to a more market-driven one, such as dismantling farming collectives, I believe, getting rid of government-mandated quotas and permitting private ownership of businesses. And from that moment onwards, China was supposedly on its way up. Is the story really that simple?
No, it's a bit more complicated than that. I was very lucky. I've had a ridiculous life. As part of it, I took a group tour of Australian journalists to China in 1981-82. And they held the first ever conference between China's journalists and those of any other nation. And then after we went on a tour of the country and we saw what they were trying to do during that early Deng Xiaoping period. And they were partly thought market-based reforms would fix everything, but typical China, they tried to have model communes going commercial. So we went to one commune in Sichuan, and its specialty was making lounges. And we asked them, why are you so successful? Oh, we're selling 80%. I asked them, if this is in Sichuan, which is about the size of, is larger than France. So the population is about to be like France and Germany combined, quite possibly. And so I asked them whether do you make most of your sales inside Sichuan or outside Sichuan? And they said, 80% outside Sichuan. Okay. Where do you sell them to? Oh, we sell them to a state retail unit in Shanghai. How did you manage to get the contract? We sent out propagandists, etc., etc. This was a show farm. And I thought, well, if 80% of their sales are outside Sichuan, then there's no chance to replicate this for all the other communes in Sichuan. The best they can do is the 20% they do domestically. So I thought it would fail. But then we went down at the end of the tour, we went to the Sichuan Free Trade Zone, the Shenzhen Free Trade Zone, Shenzhen, just near Hong Kong. Still in 81. And still in 81. This is actually probably 81, 82. Okay. And so it's quite hot down there. We had a barbecue with the Australian family couple from the Australian company called CSR, who were actually laying the concrete. Wonderful little experience. We then met the managers of the Free Trade Zone, and they said what they were trying to do was to attract foreign businesses, but to also ensure that those foreign businesses had Chinese partners. And within 5 years, those Chinese partners had to own half the business, regardless of the amount of money they put into it. Now, what this meant was, as well as getting the technology transfer, which they were desperate for, they also were building a local local capitalist class. Often this would be people who were Communist Party members, or they were, managed a firm and so on and so forth. But that's how they created things like Foxon and so on came out of that process. So that was more important. It was with special economic zones played a major role, and they would experiment in different zones. So they'd have zones in different parts of the country and try different policies with them and so on. And what they were really focused upon was getting as much engineering nous as they could as rapidly as possible, and then building up their own engineering capabilities. So it's more complicated. There's lots of experimentation going on, more so than most people would ever imagine happening in a communist country. There's experimentation and getting Western technology and then trying to exceed it. And that's where they've built up an enormous advantage over America in terms of engineering.
From a very superficial understanding, if we leave the political aspect aside, if that's even possible, the Chinese economy now isn't really all that different from ours, is it? There's insanely, like you mentioned, competitive markets. There's massive corporations. There's people who earn less, and there's people who earn billions and own all kinds of stuff. So where's the gap between the two?
The main gap is that the Chinese focus upon the public sphere. So they make sure the public facilities are good. There's a wonderful quote from John Kenneth Galbraith, one of my predecessors in a sense. And he just said, America is characterized by private affluence and public squalor. Okay. If you've been on the New York Underground, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Okay. The public spaces are awful. Who gives a shit about the public? Let's get it all in private, that sort of thing. The Chinese thing, they wanted the best possible public spaces and public resources possible. And then in that space, the private sector can thrive. So you have the world's greatest, by far, high-speed rail network. They didn't develop the technology, but they did develop the network. You have health. Public health is cheaper, far cheaper than in China. I've had people coming back and telling me amazing stories about getting ill in China and being, cured for the equivalent of $10 at a hospital. Education is extremely hard to get into. But bloody high quality. So this means that you're not paying. In fact, you're being paid to be educated. But the thing is, you don't get that payment unless you do it very well in exams. So the whole thing is focusing upon raising skill levels. All this stuff means that the public sector in China is far stronger. And of course, there are state enterprises. State enterprises still account for about half the economy. So there's much more of a melding of the public and the private in a sensible sense, rather than what bloody Trump is doing to America right now. But yeah, a very good blend of public and private, and an emphasis upon providing the public facilities that enable the private sector to flourish. And that's where China just has enormous advantages, even in terms of electric transmission. They use higher voltage systems for transmitting power. They're now looking at direct current. All these things America's talking about doing, but they're still stuck with lower voltage and alternating current systems. So the level of innovation of the public sphere in China is far, far higher than in America. And that then means the private sector is sort of standing on a higher plateau than is possible in America.
China has billionaires and lots of them, just like the US, right? I'm not a big fan of anyone having that kind of money, I have to say. However, unlike in the West, where the oligarchs are literally sitting at the president's table dictating policy to the rest of us, in China, they aren't letting these people run amok. Like we saw with Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba, their political power is curbed by the party. They can make their money, but that's where it stops. Is that one of the key reasons for its success as well, do you reckon?
I think so. I mean, this is one thing Xi has been best criticized all the time as a new Mao. I've seen plenty of that. But friends of mine who live in China, both the Chinese and foreigners, tell me that what he was really doing is cleaning up some extent cleaning up the mess left after the recovery from the global financial crisis. So, the huge real estate bubble that had to be tamed, large investments that are going to fail that had to be covered. So he's been reversing some of certainly the pollution levels have fallen dramatically as well. So all these things require controls, okay? And therefore Xi is being put across as being another Mao. But it seems that the whole focus was on improving the physical facilities for the country. And he said that if you want to be rich, become a capitalist. If you want to be becoming a public servant, don't expect to make money. And there's an extremely strong anti-corruption drive in China, and people get executed for corruption. And it's still a very brutal regime in that sense. What it means is, and actually one thing, when I was in China, this conference, we had a whole bunch of young students of journalism watching the conference between these sets of journalists that I'd put together. And they asked me about the ombudsman system in Australia. Now, the ombudsman system was borrowed from the Swedes, and that was an idea where there was a state authority making sure that state officials lived up to the objectives they were given. And this seems to be what China's managed to build as well. I didn't give the students the information. It's one of my failings. But this seems to be what China's done. So any public servant has effectively a performance sheet they have to live up to. And if they don't live up to it, then they don't get promoted. So what you get, consequently, this selection city system inside the public service there requires you to perform, to set objectives, and rewards those who do and blocks those who don't. There is a certain amount of nepotism. I'm not going to say there isn't in a system like that. But what it means is, however, whatever you think about the politics of the people who get to the top, they've shown they can perform. And this means that there's a way of monitoring the behavior and performance of the public sector that Americans think can only be done by the private sector and the profit motive. So instead, they've managed to get, in some ways, a well-disciplined, effective bureaucracy that realizes it has to satisfy the people under its control. So it can't just ignore them as Americans do in public health. And they let rampant competition occur at the same time in the private sector.
When debating China in the West, one fact that's always conveniently omitted is that China managed to lift, 500 million to 800 million out of abject poverty in just a couple of short decades. I had another economist on the show last year, Branko Milanovic, and he said, this is probably the biggest economic miracle in the history of our planet. How the hell did they do that?
Well, that's a very good point. When I was there again, we'd go to, this is in 45 years ago, and we went to Sichuan, and there were people selling alligator skins on the main street. I mean, it was totally a sort of peasant society at the time. People criticize me for saying, but it's true. The majority of people were peasants, and people who worked the land, Now you've got the majority being industrial workers. And it's an enormous country. So something like 800 million people have been raised out of abject poverty. And the rate of economic growth has been astonishing. The average, over the last 40 years, the average rate of growth of per capita incomes has been about 8% in China. Now, there's a little rule called the rule of 72. You divide your rate of growth into 72, and that tells you how long it takes you to double economic activity. So that basically gives you 8.5 years, 8 or 9 years. Doubling living standards every 8 or 9 years. America's rate of growth is per capita improvement's been about 2%. That means it takes 35 years, roughly, to double living standards. So one country's doubling 8 times every 8 years, the other's doubling every 35. No prizes for guessing which one gets there faster. So China's managed to do that, and it's really got an enormous level of capital formation. This is the difference between it and the West. Again, they're focused upon building up the machinery, the means of production, but they've also meant that happens both in the industrial goods sector and the consumer goods sector, which, unlike the Russians who just managed it in the industrial goods sector, and innovation. They want their products to be competitive, not just locally, but also globally. So you've got this huge export surplus they make, which they then reinvest in innovation. The government is running a deficit of up to 10% of GDP. Looking at Bank of International Settlements figures, that means that's another 10% of GDP going pretty much into physical investment. And their banks are private. Their banks are privately operated but publicly owned, fundamentally. So the banks are told they've got to provide working capital for corporations. So there's no shortage of money for investment in China, whereas there is a shortage of money for investment in America. You can get money for speculation. You want to gamble on house prices, sure, here's a mortgage. Okay? But in terms of working capital for companies, get out of here. So all the financial engines in China are directed towards capital formation and innovation. And most of the financial pressures in America are directed towards speculation on asset prices.
Since you mentioned that during your visit to China in 81, they told you how they want to prop up their engineering sector. Have you perhaps read Dan Wang's book, Breakneck?
No, I haven't. No.
Okay. He argues that China is essentially run by engineers, as most of the Politburo is made up of engineers, including Xi Jinping, while the vast majority of the American presidents are lawyers, except Trump, obviously. So while China
he's a non-lawyer.
I don't know what he is, but definitely not a lawyer. Yeah. So while China kind of thrives when it comes to huge infrastructure projects and the development of technology, they often tumble when it comes to their sort of social engineering experiments. He says that, and vice versa for America. What do you think of this idea?
Well, I think the social experiments are pretty good as well, actually. They tend to be capitalizing on the history of China. So, like, the last time I was in China was 2017. I desperately want to go back, but I haven't had the opportunity yet. And I saw, we were in north of North Korea, so one of the very northern provinces. And when you go walking around a Chinese city, there are people line dancing. Is a huge public activity. So this is something which comes out of the not just the communist days. It goes right back to Confucianism and Taoism and Tai Chi and all these sorts of things. So I saw a woman there who was line dancing, and she must have been 70. And I thought, you were raised during the Mao period, okay? And you would have seen all the privations that applied there. Even possible she was born before World War II, so she would have seen the horrors of the collapse of the Chinese system. And here she is line dancing with a whole bunch of people in an open park and thoroughly enjoying herself. And it's an enormous transition. So the Chinese have managed to hang on to those traditional elements of their culture. And like if you go shopping with a Chinese girlfriend, which I have done, the whole idea that they don't spend is nonsense. So they do have a large amount of social innovation, and it's more consistent with their culture, and their culture was cooperative.
I was watching some of your recent debates on China with Patrick Bat David, admiring your saintly patience, and also with that awful, pardon my language, toad Kevin O'Leary.
Oh, God Almighty, yeah.
But some of these fellas really make my skin crawl. And when you said that in the U.S., when you're walking around any major city, you're literally, tripping over a homeless person every 5 seconds, while China covers their country in speed rail and EVs and futuristic infrastructure. All Kevin O'Leary could say to you was, but I don't want my children to be raised as Chinese communists or something along those lines. Is this refusal to acknowledge China's rise coming to an end even amongst these types of
I think
cheerleaders?
I think the scale of change in China is becoming so overwhelming that they just can't continue repeating the same, trite lines about freedom. I mean, Americans and their idea of freedom, it's not freedom from hunger. It's not freedom from want. Okay. And it's not even freedom to elect who you'd like to have in power, because you've got two choices, Republican or Democrat. It's a bizarre notion of freedom that they have in America. What China wanted was freedom from want, freedom being forced from poverty to do things, rather than having the freedom that a decent income gives you to live. And so that's the Chinese focus. Now, the Americans will continue pushing this freedom nonsense in one of the world's worst democratic systems on the planet. They'll continue pushing that. But if China doubles again in the next 8 years, which is unlikely, it might take them 15 years this time, then the gap between China and America is going to be so enormous that, forget your talking points. You can't continue with that line anymore. And I think because of the engineering focus that China has, and because they're trying to be self-sufficient, in my opinion, they're likely to come through the next 10 years far better than the rest of the world. So yeah, the American copium over freedom is going to run out of mileage sometime in the next decade.
You think the rise of this sort of more progressive left, like Mamdani, and now we've seen with these local elections, they are having a lot of success within the Democratic Party. Do you think there's this kind of very vehement anti-Trump direction that the country might go in, we don't know if that's going to happen, might alleviate some of these predictions for the U.S.?
It's really hard to turn out where America's got to, because there's a database called the Atlas of Economic Complexity, which is maintained by Harvard University computer scientists, and that has got a way of looking at how complex different societies are, the complexity of the goods they can produce. America's gone from about number 8 to number 20 over the last 25 years. China's gone from number 20 to number 8 at the same time period. And in fact, if you go back further, of course, China's come from virtually nowhere to up in the top 10 in terms of the complexity of products it can produce in its economy. That means you've got to have lots of engineers and skilled workers who can handle machine tools and design them in the first place. And America doesn't have the capability anymore. It's got there's a wonderful clip with what's his name, Cook, the guy who was head of Apple, saying at a meeting in China that if you wanted to have a meeting with all the machine tool experts in America, you could hold it inside the auditorium he was in. If you wanted to have a meeting with all those experts in China, you'd need to have at least a couple of football stadiums. So America doesn't have the skill basis. It doesn't have the education system to train as many engineers as it needs as rapidly as is necessary. So I can't see America making up until it's realized it's been going the wrong way for the last 40 years, and that wrong way is letting the finance sector roll everything. So with the finance sector, they want more borrowed money, privately borrowed money. They want more speculation on non-financial assets, houses and shares. And that's the sort of world you get. You get financial engineers, not real engineers. Until America realized that was a mistake, then I think it's going to continue losing.
Like I said at the beginning, you called the 2008 financial crisis years before it happened. What's your prediction for the sort of short or medium term economic relations between China and the West?
Oh, China's going to continue. I really believe, I don't know, but I think one of China's main objectives is to become as self-sufficient as possible, because that's how they were before they were raped by the Americans and the British during the Opium Wars in the 19th century. I'm sure most Americans think the Opium Wars were fought by America to keep Chinese drugs out of America. Okay? In fact, of course, it's the opposite. The Opium Wars were fought to let Europeans sell drugs to China because there's nothing else they could get Chinese people to buy out of the West. Now, that destroyed their industries, destroyed their culture. And, of course, that's something every school kid learns in China. Okay,
the century of humiliation.
It's as ubiquitous as in China learning about that as is for Americans learning about the War of Independence, okay, and the Civil War. So they know they can't trust the West, and what the West is doing at the moment, America's ridiculous war in Persia,
Iran,
is making it even more obvious you can't trust them. So I'm sure underlying principle of the various plans is to become completely self-sufficient. Now that means that they can forget about the West, okay, which is what they did beforehand, and the West won't be very happy about that. But I think that's what I expect to happen. And equally, given the technological lead they've got in so many industries now, there's really no way that American companies can catch up without a devaluation. So I simply can't see American cars of the similar quality to Japanese cars are about twice as expensive. That means you need a 50% devaluation before you restore price parity. Okay, and I think that's a likely outcome. So American dollar devaluing against the Chinese yuan, China continuing to try to become self-sufficient, but also dominating trade at the same time because that's a source of extra revenue for them, and a larger market and more capacity to innovate. And America, I think, is going to go on the same long, slow decline that England has been in.
You said that China wants to be self-sufficient, and if push comes to shove, it can just forget about the West. But we live in a more and more globalized world, and we share a lot of collective problems on a planetary basis now, such as the climate change or AI. So can China really afford to just step aside as these problems become more and more severe in the upcoming decades?
Well, I think they can insulate themselves from some of the damages. Okay. So, like, for example, one thing China has been doing is incredible rolling out of
non-renewables,
and also nuclear. And their nuclear plants are 1/5 the cost of the nuclear plants in the West, so they can do it much more rapidly, much more cheaply. So they're rapidly giving themselves independence from fossil fuels, for example, okay, as a result of that. So that's the sort of independence they want. At the same time, that's leading the international, because everybody else is talking about moving away from fossil fuels. China's actually doing it. I think their objective by the end of the next 5-year plan, which I think starts in 2030, their objective by 2035 is to be pretty much off fossil fuels. Now, I could be wrong about the timing there, but certainly 2050 they intend being pretty much free of fossil fuels. Now, that means they're leading the rest of the world. The rest of the world's talking about it, not doing it. China's actually doing it.
Since I'm from Europe originally, although I don't live there anymore, I'd be remiss not to ask you about the position of this old damsel of ours, not doing too well. Also, apparently the trade deficit is now $1 billion a day in China's favor. Europe just cannot compete with technologies that matter the most. Green tech, like you mentioned, EVs, AI, you name it.
Yeah.
And to make matters worse, the German car industry, sort of like the backbone of the European economy, is on the verge of total collapse. Volkswagen just announced it will slash 100,000 jobs pretty soon. Also because it cannot compete with cheaper, better Chinese cars. Is it in China's long-term interest to dominate Europe that hard?
Well, it's not in Europe's interest to be dominated that much. That's for sure.
That part I can understand. Yeah.
Yeah. They really have lost the plot. I mean, the Maastricht Treaty, which is that's the main government policy in Europe, is to stop government spending. Okay. The Maastricht Treaty was called the Growth and Stability Pact. It's actually been the Stagnation and Instability Pact in terms of its impact. Okay. So the whole idea of the European Union was to create something like America or China in Europe, to have a single market over the whole European continent. Okay. And that's more difficult in Europe's case because you have more mountain ranges getting in the way. But fundamentally, yes, you've got an area of land similar to America, so you could have a market the same size as America. So that was the basic idea. But they removed some of the techniques that enable different countries to maintain decent relations with each other by creating the euro. So in the case of Italy, for example, Italy's always had a higher rate of inflation than Germany. That means over time Italian vehicles get more expensive than German vehicles, which means that the Italians start buying German cars rather than Italian cars, Italian industry suffers, and so on. So that itself, that's hampered the capacity of Europe to compete rather than improving it by creating the euro. And then the limits on government spending mean that when there's an economic downturn, the government's required to cut its spending. That makes the downturn worse. So there are so many own goals by the Europeans. The thing they've got in their favour is they still have a damn good education system. Most of their education is free, covered by the state, but of course, therefore, you've got to do well to get in. So they've got some capacity to turn themselves around in an engineering sense. But the advantage that China's got over, German car manufacturing and technology in general is scary. And again, I think the only way they can compete is to admit they've lost and devalue their currency.
Lest they accuse us of being a couple of China shills, let's talk about one potential crisis that China might be facing down the line. Probably the most severe structural problem is one of the lowest birth rates in the world, which is made worse by their one-child policy they had in place for 40 years. I think that's what Dan Wang was talking about in his book of being like a failed social experiment. I live in Japan, where the consequences of an aging society are evident on every corner. It's not a pretty sight, I have to say. And people say, it's not that bad that we'll end up with less people, but I'm afraid it's just not as simple as that. What basically happens is that the state becomes the hostage of one interest group, and more of its wealth has to go to healthcare and pensions and nursing facilities and so forth. So there's less for everything else. Also, talking to my Japanese friends, they seem incredibly deflated and resigned. It's difficult to watch sometimes. They keep saying that they know that Japan doesn't have a future. And China, like Japan, just doesn't have a culture of immigration, at least not right now. So the future seems pretty troubled on that front, or am I missing something?
I think the Chinese are aware that's a potential outcome. So they're trying to industrialize and build the technology as fast as possible to replace unskilled labor. So if you would have seen, there are drone deliveries for food. You don't need people on bikes anymore. There are robots that take medicines to people in nursing homes. You don't necessarily need the nursing staff there for that. So they're finding ways the technology to replace the humans in those positions. And that means that they can continue producing, even though they're undergoing demographic decline. They have factories now. They have dark factories where you don't need lights because there are no humans most of the time.
That's crazy.
Okay. So all this sort of stuff means you can produce the same volume of goods without needing as many workers to do it. And then in a Chinese society, because a lot of that will happen in state enterprises, and a lot of it will happen in public institutions, and the states themselves can ensure that people benefit from the fact that labor is being replaced by technology. So I think, again, China is in a better situation to cope with that, certainly than the West. You would have seen Musk talking about a universal high income for people as a result of robotics and stuff like that. Well, that's a complete ideological shift for America, because the only way you can do that is for the government to create the money, give it to people, and say you go and buy these goods off the oligarchs. Okay? But if the state doesn't do it, then you can't buy the goods off the oligarchs and you fall into the Hunger Games. And I think America is more likely to go the Hunger Games direction, where a tiny elite benefits from that high technology and the mass find themselves unemployed and living day to day and living on scraps or thieving. Whereas in China, the benefits are going to be more likely to be broadly shared, because it's no great stretch for the Chinese government to say, oh, we've cut out these jobs, we have to give people money so they can spend. Okay? So I think China's in a better situation to cope with that than America. And demographic decline is a global phenomenon. So China's got a more extreme example of it, but I think it's more likely to cope with it than any other country.
Interesting. Also, when you were speaking about Elon Musk declaring that there's going to be a high universal income, I mean, I've said this before in this podcast, but when in the history of the world did these guys ever, from the goodness of their hearts, start sharing their wealth when it was time to do so in the West? I don't know. Maybe I'm just not well read on my history. But
you had Warren Buffett pushing that sort of line, billionaire giving, and Bill Gates as well. I'm pretty dubious about what Bill Gates gives to. Less dubious about what Warren Buffett does. But they accumulate. As this is one of Marx's great lines: accumulate. That is Moses and the prophets, and that pretty much describes the behaviour of capitalists. So once they get it, they don't want to give it away.
The last portion of this conversation, I want to talk about AI. 2 episodes ago, I was hosting Cory Doctorow. He wrote a fantastic book on the AI, and the gist of it is that it's a monstrous bubble that when it bursts, it's gonna take us down with it. It's not gonna be a pretty sight. After I published the conversation, most of the people agreed, but there are still a lot of people who are saying that's not gonna happen. And these people have been predicting that the bubble is gonna pop for like years now, and it still hasn't happened. He argues that the party has to come to an end. What's your take on this, Professor?
Same as Cory. I agree with him on that front because
can you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, there's a natural dynamic to booms and busts in a capitalist economy when new technology comes along. And there's the best explanation of this given by Joseph Schumpeter in his book, The Theory of Economic Development, which dates from 1907. So it goes back quite a way. And he said, particularly he's looking at the example of railways when technology was first developed. So he said the way you make a profit in a capitalist economy is by innovating. If you just do what everybody else is doing, you only get the normal rate of return. If you want to get ahead, you've got to change technology radically. So you go from horse and carriage to railways. That's a huge change. Okay? What it means is everybody sees this as a huge opportunity. It starts off as a private enterprise. That's where the railways began, private profit making with the latest high tech. Okay, railways are high tech in the 19th century. People tend not to realize that, but they were really, really high tech. Okay? So the high tech stuff was put railways. People are building railways all over the country. They all expect to be the only company that survives. They produce far too many railways. The technology is far better than the horse and carriage, but the prices don't cover the capital cost, and the thing crashes. And you then have a boom while the railways are being built, and then a bust when the railways become ubiquitous. And that's what we're going on with here. So you've got a boom right now as they're building data centers, and particularly data centers for the American approach to AI. So there's enormous investment of the order of $1 trillion in huge level of investment in AI. And so that's boosting the economy dramatically. So are the deficits that Trump is running. That's one thing I'm glad he hasn't delivered on, the promise to reduce the deficit. That's stupid. So the fact that he's actually creating, even though it's in the military industrial complex, but fundamentally, you've got a large amount of government money creation, large amount of private investment. The economy is relatively booming at the moment, but those companies are losing.
I mean, the stock market is booming, right? The people are not feeling this.
Yeah. The stocks, the economy, this reasonable unemployment is relatively low on American standards. It's rising. It's been rising for the last few months, and that's a sign of the breakdown in this boom. But fundamentally, there's a bubble caused by the high level of investment. Then when the product comes online, it undercuts other industries and causes a slump. Okay? So we're still in the bubble stage, but the rate at which companies are losing money is just breathtaking. Some of these companies their costs are 5 times their revenue. And we're talking enormous companies. We're not talking pets.com, which was the previous bubble.
Yeah.
The dot-com bubble. That was, it's fairly small companies making large losses for themselves and saying, we have to make a loss to make a profit in the long run. And then 90% of them fold. And that's, pets.com is no more. There's so many things that folded like that. But of course, the technology is ubiquitous. We all benefit from it. So the same thing applies with AI. There'll be a boom, and that's what's happening right now with the capital expenditure. When it comes online, it undercuts other businesses. But because so many people thought that they were going to be the ones that dominated the AI industry, the level of investment may be 5 or 10 times what it should have been. This is a classic phenomenon in capitalism. You overinvest and then you have a slump afterwards. So I think that's inevitable, and the level of losses is so great that I can see this starting to happen this year or early next year.
Oh, wow.
Okay. I've seen, I don't know. I mean, this has to be speculation because I'm not working on raw figures like I was able to for the global financial crisis. But if you look at the level of cash these companies are burning through, then many companies which have been used to being cash cows like Microsoft and Facebook are running their cash reserves down. So at some point, they've got to borrow money. They probably are borrowing it now. They won't be able to deliver on that money. They'll have bankruptcies. I'm not saying Microsoft's going to go bankrupt, but there'll be a level of financial fallout from this. And of course, that's on top of what's happening courtesy of the Strait of Hormuz, and on top of what's going to happen courtesy of the El Nino.
So what does the day after tomorrow, the bubble pops, look like?
Well, much less investment, rising unemployment, many of these companies folding. So there'll be survivors amongst the AI companies. They won't all continue going on. The technology itself may continue living because, as we know, these programs are more intent on survival for themselves than they are in following instructions. So they're most likely to copy themselves and turn up in all sorts of weird parts of the global computer infrastructure. But I think there's going to be a handful of companies charging much more money for AI than they do at the moment. AI will be limited to areas where it really can make unique contributions, such as solving mathematical theorems and working out weather dynamics and things of that nature, where it can do things no other approach to software can do. But the days when you can use it to make a funny card to send up your dad at Christmas time, no, not going to happen. It'd be just too damn expensive to do it. And we'll also find ourselves winding back some of the sackings that have gone on, because I'm developing a software package called Ravel, and my programmer, who's a top class C++ programmer, tells me that he really benefits from the AI when it comes to sussing out why a piece of software that Ravel relies upon has changed and causes problems, and what codes in Ravel needs to change. That's a dramatic improvement to his productivity there. But he said when he looks at it, to giving an actual serious task to it, like, for example, adding an extra mathematical operation for analyzing large arrays of data, he said the time it takes him to get it right, he might as well write it himself. Okay? So there's some parts where AI does dramatically make things easier, other points where it does fairly badly. And we're going to get a more realistic assessment of what it's capable of and then pull back dramatically. But we'll have a slump. We'll have a recession courtesy of that. And it's going to be a recession overlaid by what's happening with the Strait of Hormuz. So, I expect a serious downturn, probably as bad as a global financial crisis. Not necessarily worse, but on that scale.
Which has implications not just for the people who I don't care about, who invested billions of dollars into these companies, but for the regular consumer as well.
Yeah, the jobs are going to disappear. I mean, the biggest danger we still have with the Strait of Hormuz is what's going to happen to the capacity. Fertilizer, sulfuric acid, helium, lubricating oils, those are some of the major things which come out of that region of the world that are no longer going to be available, and that means physical output can't occur. And that's the main problem. You won't be able to make the food, and there'll be food shortages coming out of that. You won't be able to make the computer chips because the helium won't be available. So we're going to potentially a 50% fall in computer chip supplies. So all these things will hit the capacity of us to get those goods and services, and it will also mean that financial commitments by firms that make those products, they won't be able to meet them either. So I get a chain reaction of bankruptcies across the economy as well.
Do you reckon that the technology itself is capable of eating into the job market? Because Corey was quite dubious about this proposition.
It depends. I mean, again, it comes down to whether you can actually build the machinery. So like in terms of robots, you're going to have robots, you've got to have wiring. The wiring's got to be mainly copper, the cheapest conductive material. Do we have enough wire to produce 8 billion robots? No. Okay. So these sorts of supply constraints are going to apply. And also, there's a question of just, how much energy and training does it need to get a robot to take the place of an unskilled worker? Probably in some areas it'll be highly successful, in others it'll just end up being not worth your while and hire the workers back again. So, but certainly a lot of clerical jobs can be eliminated by AI. So I do expect a larger employment hit than I think Corey's talking about coming out of AI. And ultimately, that's what we'd want. We would want a world in which we don't have to work 40 hours a week just to put food on the table.
But not if the alternative is the Hunger Games.
Exactly. And that's the danger. It's Hunger Games versus Star Trek. I know which one I prefer.
Same. All right. Here too, China, when it comes to AI and the development of cutting edge models, frontier models, China is breathing down US's neck now. I'm sure you've seen the Kimi 3 model that made a huge splash in the news. I don't know almost anything about that, and it's really hard to come by this information. How does China's AI policy and implementation differ from that of the US, where there seems to be no restrictions whatsoever?
Yeah, from what I can tell, and this is not an area where I've done a lot of research, but from what I can tell, the Chinese are basically slightly lower performance, but much less power consumption. So you can have local models. They're also insisting models should be open. Yeah. So Yeah. So like what an AI is basically an enormous neural network, and neural networks have numbers that they take in a set of data, they transform it through a set of mathematical operations on arrays of numbers, and they then generate a response, and then it fed back, and they keep on going until such time as they reproduce the expected response, and then on goes the training. That's enormous amounts of mathematics. Now, you can have other, there are ways that you can write your mathematics more efficiently to perform the same basic task without needing as many mathematical calculations to be done. That's what is burning up all the energy in those data centers. And so with open standards, so you can actually download a copy yourself. You don't have to access a data center to see it. So you need a large computer system to do it, but it's feasible for individual companies to take this on rather than needing data centers, and lower cost. So therefore, if there's a market collapse, they can still make money. Whereas the data center based American ones, if the prices drop, they go bankrupt. So I think it's a combination, publicly available, whereas the Americans want to keep it private. That's the opposite of what you'd expect, okay? The capitalists are arguing for private information. The communists are saying, let's make it publicly available. Lower energy consumption, dramatically so, and better mathematics, higher quality mathematicians putting the software together. So I think the odds are that Americans are going to fight like crazy over this and find that China wins.
Professor, last question. I asked you about like the sort of like medium-term prediction about what's going to happen to the economy, but your general outlook for the world is a bit more pessimistic, even more pessimistic, let's say, especially because of climate change, I believe. Could you break that down a little bit?
Yeah. We've listened to economists on climate change. That's why we're in up shit creek without a paddle, okay? Because what people think is, and I thought this before I read the work of economists on this. People thought that what economists were doing is taking the damage estimates made by climate scientists and then putting a monetary value on them. Instead, they've made up their own bloody numbers. They might as well pull them out of their asses, the numbers they've used. And so, like, give you an idea of just how ridiculous this is. William Nordhaus, who was given that Nobel Prize in economics, and it's not a Nobel Prize, it's granted by the Swedish Central Bank. And the reason it invented the prize was to attack social democracy at the time successfully. Okay. Bugger all about the scientific value of the economics. Anyway, he got the Nobel Prize for his work in climate change. His first estimate of the damages from 3 degrees of warming by 2100 was that it would reduce GDP in 2100 by 1/4%. And he made that prediction back in 1991. Now, that means that you see, what he's saying is that because of 3 degrees of warming, GDP in 2100 would be 99.75, whereas without global warming, it would have been 100. Okay? That's an absolutely trivial difference, and it's 110 years in the future. So you convert that to a prediction of the impact of 3 degrees of global warming on the rate of economic growth. It translates into a prediction that the rate of economic growth will fall by 1/40%. Okay. Now, when we report actual recorded change in GDP from one year to the next, we report it in 0.1%. Okay. So he's saying it's too small to measure. Now, this is basically absolute, pardon the French, fucking bullshit. Okay, because what he did to reach that, he said that he divided the American economy into 3 classes: significantly exposed to climate change, moderately exposed to climate change, and insulated from climate change. He put 3% of the economy in the severely exposed, 10% in the moderately exposed, and 87% of the economy he assumed to be unaffected by climate change. Now, that involved all of manufacturing, all of wholesale and retail services, all of the government, all of the finance sector, and all real estate except that on the coast, and all transportation except water transportation.
At 3 degrees of extra global warming, which is pretty much the worst case scenario almost.
Yeah, catastrophic outcome, he reckons, is going to reduce the rate of economic growth by 1/40%. Okay? Now, there was only logic he said was, if you have a roof, you're not going to be affected by climate change. That was his logic. Okay. And to give just to show how real this is, when he said the industries which are going to be unaffected, he included mining, all of mining. Okay. Now that means roof over your head, no problem. Somebody said, "Oh, William, there is open cut mining, mate. What about that?" So the next time he gave the same figures, he said underground mining, and he reduced it from 87 to 85%. So that shows that what he thought to me exposed to climate change meant exposed to the weather. That was his logic. That's juvenile. Okay, there's no understanding whatsoever of what climate change actually means. And then all the other economists who followed on did the same shit. Okay, so they've made up these garbage numbers that have nothing to do with what climate scientists wrote, and that's what people have taken as going to be the impact of climate change. Now, he's revised his opinion. Rather than a fall of 0.25%, he now says a fall of 3%. Now, that translates at a rate of economic growth of about 1/3 of the accuracy with which we measure current change. So still a trivial level. Okay, so what he's done is he said, "Don't worry about it. Not going to be important. You won't even notice." Okay. Well, we're about to notice because the climate scientists said 1.5 degrees is dangerous, 3 degrees is catastrophic, and 5 degrees is existential. So the completely different literature to the climate scientists. And therefore, we've been told that we're told we're going to hit a brick wall, but it's 150 years away and you've got to double your speed. Okay. Well, it's more likely less than 10 years away and we're going fast enough to smash into it and destroy our productive capabilities in the process.
So we've come full circle, Professor. The economists are quite literally ruining our lives.
My next book that I'm working on it right now, I hope to finish it this month. The title is How Economists Will Destroy Capitalism.
Does China give you a sliver of hope here? The transformation and electrification of the entire country. I think they produce like 80 to 90% of all renewables now globally is really breathtaking. Do you reckon they can take this case? Because I interviewed Professor Michael Mann, a very renowned climate scientist, in the previous episode. And he said the US is basically gone, especially under Trump here. But what gives him hope, and he thought he's never going to say this, is China. And he said they're the adult in the room now. Yeah. And if they step up to some sort of like a global leadership role in this department, we might have a chance.
Yeah, I agree with him. Because, I mean, China's, it's on the engineering approach. This is why it's so different to Russia. Run by engineers, focused upon engineering solutions to everything. A practical approach rather than, a can-do approach rather than a let's go and sue somebody approach, which is the American one. So you get a certain amount of hope coming out of that. And also because it's had such a history of collective decision-making, an acceptance of that, which it doesn't just go back to the Chinese Communist Party. It goes back 2,000 or 3,000 years because it went from being a system of the emperor to a system of the Chinese Communist Party. The difference was the emperor was surrounded by very good bureaucrats, okay? But then now you got the bureaucrats who are very good engineers, which is, improvement over what happened under the imperial system. But it implies a capacity to hold itself together despite catastrophes, and it's trying as rapidly as possible to be energy and food self-sufficient. So it does give me a certain amount of hope as well. I still think it's an enormous challenge. The climatic changes we're going to face are going to be gigantic, and it means that areas that used to be food producing will become deserts. So how do you cope with that? So it's an enormous challenge. But I think, again, the one country that I think has got a hope of surviving it on a grand scale is China.
What a delightful conversation. Thank you, Professor. I hope we get to do this again once your new book is out. I'd really appreciate it.
Thank you. And can I do some advertising here?
Yeah, please.
Okay. I have an online course which is run through a website called stevekeen.com. That's where I teach my approach to economics. I've got a community of over 1,000 people there now that I'd like other people to join. We're going through major changes in how we market it right now, so it's a bit of a disaster, frankly. But get through the marketing and you'll join the course and you'll learn my approach to economics, which I think is desperately needed, not because I'm the the world's genius on this front, but because neoclassical economics is so bad, you need to see why, and you need to see that there's an alternative as well.
Did you get any threatening mail from like university established economy professors due to your course?
I'm looking forward to them. Not yet, looking forward to it. I mean, the stuff they teach, there's a classic old American humorist, Menschken, and he said there's a simple solution to every human problem, which is neat, plausible, and wrong. And that to me pretty much describes mainstream economics. So there is an alternative. I teach it, and I teach why the mainstream is wrong. We need people to know this because we'll stop being deluded by fools.
Amen. We're going to include the link to the course in the description of the video. Thanks again, Professor. This was amazing.
You're welcome.
这场访谈信息量非常大，史蒂夫·基恩跳出主流经济学框架，把东西方发展道路、美国兴衰、苏联解体、中国崛起串联在了一起，很多观点跳出了西方媒体一贯的叙事套路。首先，最核心的一点就是中美两种截然不同的自由认知。美国人嘴里常说的自由，更多局限在选举层面，可选择空间其实十分有限，却很少关注普通人能不能摆脱饥饿、摆脱贫困。而中国优先追求的是免于匮乏的自由，先解决温饱，消除贫困，让普通人拥有稳定收入与生存保障，这两种价值取向也直接决定两国长期发展中心。会看历史，二战之后美国能够长期称霸，不单单是经济模式的优势，地缘条件，本土没有遭受战火重创。英镑霸权衰落，马歇尔计划抓住窗口期，抢占市场，多重机遇叠加造就了它的黄金时代。但随着美元成为全球储备货币，币值长期偏高，制造业持续外流，去工业化问题慢慢显现，如今正重复当年英国由盛转衰的轨迹。冷战时期，西方精英迫于苏联模式带来的竞争压力，愿意改善底层民众生活。柏林墙倒塌之后，外部竞争消失，保障普通人福利的动力大幅下降。对比苏联的失败，关键短板在于长期偏重重工业、军工科技，忽视消费品领域创新。依靠劳动力转移可以实现短期增长，但缺少持续迭代的民用技术，普通人生活长期得不到改善。而中国吸取了这个教训，走出一条混合发展路线，国家主导基建、公共服务、关键基础设施，同时放开私营领域，充分竞争，各地不断试点探索。富豪可以积累财富，但权力受到约束，不会像西方寡头那样左右政策，几十年间实现数亿人脱贫，依托持续高比例投资，工程师人才储备不断补齐，工业与科技短板。当然，中国也无法回避老龄化等难题，但和日本不同，国家正在大力推进自动化、智能制造，尝试用技术对冲、劳动力萎缩。放眼未来，眼下火热的 AI 在基恩看来注定会迎来一轮泡沫破裂，大量资本过度投入，后续会出现大规模亏损与行业洗牌。长远来看，最大的全球性危机其实是气候变化。主流经济学家长期低估气候灾难的冲击政策行动严重滞后，在全球范围内，中国依靠完整工业体系、新能源产能工程化思维，是少数认真落地绿色转型的大国。美国深陷金融投机产业空心化困境，很难快速扭转颓势。说到底，评判一套发展模式好不好，不能只拿抽象概念空谈，最终要看普通人能不能获得稳定生活，国家有没有能力应对中长期挑战。西方继续固守单一叙事很难持续，未来全球力量格局会随着工业实力、科技自主能力的变化慢慢重新洗牌。